We're expecting a different moderator here. The past president of AWG was on her way, but I think Al Gore grabbed her, and so she's still chatting with him. But she should be here shortly. So the introductory remarks would say, my name is Carol Finn, but I'm not Carol Finn. I'm Billy Williams with AGU, and I'm happy to introduce this session for you today. And again, as you may be aware, recent high-profile events have placed the issue of harassment in the scientific community in the spotlight, including the role of scientific societies in helping to respond to this and other work climate issues. Today, we will attempt to address these issues head-on and with the focus on the actions AGU and other scientific societies can take to support our members. And I'd like to, at this point, to welcome Carol Finn to the stage to take over from my comments. They know where, I was treading water. They know where you were, so you're all good. So I'll turn it over to Carol to introduce this session as the past president of AGU. So today we are.
Well, thanks. Sorry I was late. It's the perils of meeting people, meet and greets. But I'm really happy to be here. This is a really important issue for me personally and also for AGU. And today we're going to attempt to address issues head-on with the focus of actions that AGU and other scientific societies can take to support our members in responding to issues of harassment. But before I go further, I'd like to acknowledge that this session is co-sponsored by AGU, the Earth Science Women's Network, and the Association for Women Geoscientists. And we're very grateful for the leadership and support of ESWN and AWG in making this session possible. As further background for today, and as many of you may have experienced, the issue of harassment and other workplace issues is complex, especially related to the role for scientific societies. Research has shown that when it comes to harassment, codes of conduct and sexual harassment policies are not regularly encountered by students and early career members in the geosciences. Even when a clear mechanism for reporting workplace or field experience incidents is known, many are not satisfied with the outcome. And in many cases, the targets of harassment often fear career-related repercussions if they speak out. AGU does have a scientific ethics and professional integrity policy, but it is geared mostly towards research integrity, and it does not explicitly address member behavior in this arena, only elected leaders. So our code of conduct for the meetings, like the fall meeting, does explicitly state that harassment, intimidation, or discrimination in any form will not be tolerated, and details a variety of consequences for such behavior. In the end, however, there's not a specific policy, process, and expectation for dealing with harassment, despite the implications for scientific societies in their ability to respond to misconduct, particularly when that misconduct takes place in a member's private workplace. Today, with your help, we will explore these topics more fully and provide input back to AGU's leadership as a means to improve our policies and practices. To help uncover and give additional context for these topics in our Q&A session, our agenda today will be as follows. Oh, I got it. Next slide. This one. So we'll hear first from these three invited speakers who have either researched this area or have direct experience in responding to these issues themselves. Following each of their brief presentations will be the Q&A session, which I will moderate, and I ask that you please hold your questions until the Q&A portion of the session. So do I go back to, yeah. So our speakers for today are Christine Williams, who's a professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. She's an expert on gender, race, and class inequality in the workplace and has done extensive research on sexual harassment. Meg Urry is the Israel Munson Professor of the Physics and Astronomy Department at Yale University and Director of the Yale Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics. She is President of the American Astronomical Society. Marianne Holmes is a Professor of Practice in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is also the author of Women in the Geosciences, Practical Positive Practices Towards Parity. And Blair Schneider is the president of the Association for Women Geoscientists. She's also a doctoral student in the Department of Geology at the University of Kansas. Erika Marin-Spiotta is a board member and diversity chair of the Earth Science Women's Networks. She's an assistant professor of geology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Eric Davidson is AGU's president-elect. He's a professor and director of the Appalachian Laboratory at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. So I'm looking very much forward to the presentations, and I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Williams.
Is this your iPad? There you go. Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm a sociologist who specializes in the study of gender inequality in work organizations, and I've spent this past several years studying women geoscientists in the oil and gas industry. Today I've been asked to talk to you today about questions regarding the role of scientific societies in responding to sexual harassment and gender discrimination in the workplace. The first question is, why now? Why are issues of discrimination and sexual harassment of scientists in the spotlight today? There's no evidence that the incidences of harassment and discrimination are increasing. In fact, some of the senior women geoscientists that I've interviewed insist that sexism was much more entrenched and blatant 20 years ago than it is today. However, what is increasing is public acknowledgement of these problems. More people are aware of these issues thanks to a number of social problems. First of all, increased diversity itself. In her presentation, Professor Holmes will document the dramatic increase in the number of women geoscientists at every level. As scientific professions become more inclusive of women, it's inevitable that new agendas will emerge into the spotlight, including women's experiences of gender discrimination and sexual harassment. Second, public awareness has also increased due to federal laws. Granted, laws prohibiting discrimination in education and employment have been on the books since the 1960s. However, there have been renewed efforts at enforcement. Most recently is the Clery Act, amended in 2014. This federal law requires universities to file reports on sexual assaults of students, institute programs to prevent them, and provide services to help students who are victimized. Those of you who work in universities may have noticed a proliferation of public notices on topics like sexual assault, sexual consent, and dating violence of late. That's because of the Clery Act. As a result of their exposure to these campaigns, new graduates may be entering the scientific workforce expecting their workplaces to be free of discrimination and harassment. That is a result of the Clery Act. And as a result of Clery, they may be more willing to speak out when they encounter these problems. Another factor leading to the increased acknowledgement of these problems is NSF Advance. This has played a key role in publicizing the barriers that exist for women in the sciences, another topic that Professor Holmes will address. Finally is the role of social media. It's playing a very important role in publicizing misconduct. Episodes of discrimination and harassment that may have once been quietly swept under the carpet and quickly forgotten about instead can become instant internet memes that garner intense public scrutiny. Professor Urry will address this issue in her presentation. The second question I'm going to address is, why are scientific societies addressing these issues today? There are a number of reasons why professional associations are becoming involved in these issues, even though in some cases this has meant moving them out of their traditional comfort zones. First, they feel compelled to act because they have an inherent interest in the regulation of members' professional conduct. Scientists must convince the general public that they are worthy of federal research support. To shore up their credibility with the public, scientific societies may decide to police the professional behavior of their members. This is not a new role for scientific societies. Preserving and protecting professional reputations is what they were originally designed to do. But today, in contrast to the madman era of 30, 40, or 50 years ago, behaving professionally increasingly means acting without gender bias and refraining from sexual harassment. Second, scientific societies are getting involved in these issues because their members demand it. Some members turn to their professional associations when they feel unable to take individual action against their employers, their professors, or their colleagues. The geoscientists that I've interviewed often spoke of the dangers of complaining. Whistleblowers are often punished, and corporations as well as universities often seem more interested in avoiding lawsuits than in helping the victims. One geoscientist who experienced discrimination throughout her 30-year career told me that she never once complained to HR because doing so would be, in her words, the kiss of death. At the start of her career, she was warned that if she complained, she would never work in the oil industry again. Because scientific societies are independent of the employment relationship, they may be seen as better positioned than employers to take action on behalf of members who have been aggrieved. And third, scientific societies are getting involved in these issues because, like universities and other employers, they can be held liable if discrimination or harassment occurs in their offices or during a sponsored event. And I do notice that AGU posts a code of conduct for its meetings where it defines discrimination and harassment as unacceptable behaviors that can get attendees removed from sessions and also thrown out of the meetings altogether. It's actually printed on page 4 of your program. So what are other scientific societies doing? When I looked at the AGU website, I didn't find any mention of sexual harassment or discrimination in your code of ethics. Many scientific societies, including several in the natural sciences, do include anti-discrimination language in their ethics codes. So, for example, the American Chemical Society says this in its code of ethics: chemical professionals should carefully avoid any bias based on race, gender, age, religion, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity, presence of disabilities, educational background, or other personal attributes. For many scientific societies, that's enough. Put it in the ethics code, that's all they want to do. Other scientific societies take this a step further by including an enforcement mechanism in their bylaws. This is the trend in the medical and the social sciences. The enforcement mechanism lays out a procedure to investigate charges of ethical misconduct, including harassment and discrimination, and imposes penalties, which can range from private reprimand to permanent revoking of membership. A third step taken by some scientific societies is to collect and disseminate research on barriers to women in the professions. Earlier this week, in fact, I met with a group of women structural engineers in Northern California whose professional association is sponsoring a survey on women's leadership. Some societies also provide social support to their members who have been personally victimized by gender discrimination and harassment. They can, for example, write letters to employers stating their support for the aggrieved individual and explaining their commitment to the advancement of women in science. I personally belong to a society that also provides economic support to those engaged in legal battles with their employers. These kinds of activities are usually undertaken by organizations that have the specific and sole purpose of advancing the careers of women scientists. In these societies, all members share a common goal of supporting women, making these measures less controversial than they might be in the larger associations. So finally, what should AGU do? My number one piece of advice to you is do not rely on outsiders or the social media to regulate the professional conduct of members. Self-regulation is a hallmark of a profession, and you should not exceed this control to another body. If you do decide to write a new ethics policy, I advise you to consult with other scientific societies. Professor Urry will address the steps currently being taken by the American Astronomical Association. Believe me, you are not the only organization that has grappled with these issues. There is no need to reinvent the wheel when you can benefit from the experience of other groups, including associations in the medical and behavioral sciences. And finally, I advise you to reserve an independent role for AWG and ESWN. Because of their smaller size and specific mission, they may be better able to act more nimbly and more effectively than AGU to support the needs of individual women who have experienced discrimination or harassment. Thank you again for inviting me. I look forward to discussing these important issues with you.
So I'm here today because I'm president of the American Astronomical Society, and if you weren't out of the country in October, you probably heard about our big scandal. So we've been dealing with this explicitly for a while now. But let me start by asking you to just think back to your first AGU meeting. You were probably maybe an undergraduate, you had done your first research project, you were coming to talk about it here, and when Mr. Senior Guy came up to your poster and asked you about it, you were probably in awe, thinking, wow, I've read this guy's papers, I know who he is, this is so cool. That interaction is really different depending on if the poster author is a woman or a man, because, and I don't mean to be heteronormative, but it's much more likely that Mr. Senior Guy is going to express a potential sexual interest in a young woman than in a young man. So he comes up to the poster, he wants to know about it. Does he actually want to know about it, or does he want to know about the author? And the problem is that when you combine professional discussion with innuendo and flirting, the line becomes blurred. In contrast, when Mr. Senior Guy talks to a young man, typically it's far more likely that it's only about the science and not about personal interaction. People sometimes wonder why women have less confidence in their work than men. That's what our research shows. Actually, not my research, but sociologists' research shows that men are usually overconfident and women are usually underconfident relative to their abilities. I submit it could be in part be because we get such mixed messages in our workplaces. Especially, in male-dominated fields like geology, physics, and so on. So now to talk about what the American Astronomical Society is doing. Our bylaws prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender, gender identity or expression, race, color, national or ethnic origin, religion or religious belief, age, marital status, sexual orientation, disabilities, veteran status, or any other reason not related to scientific merit. In 2008, the AAS adopted an anti-harassment policy, which pertains in every venue that we own. So it pertains at our meetings or in our executive office and so on. The policy states that it is the policy of the American Astronomical Society that all participants in society activities will enjoy an environment free of all forms of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. As a professional society, the AAS is committed to providing an atmosphere that encourages the free expression and exchange of scientific ideas. The policy goes on to define sexual harassment as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. And it gives examples of behavior that, when unwelcome, may constitute sexual harassment, such as sexual flirtations, advances, or propositions, verbal comments or physical actions of a sexual nature, sexually degrading words used to describe an individual, a display of sexually suggestive objects or pictures, sexually explicit jokes, and unnecessary touching. The policy also prohibits other kinds of harassment, but I'll skip them here in the interest of time. Our policy also outlines a procedure for reporting violations and for investigating them, and it describes what possible sanctions might be. The policy has been working reasonably well in that we have satisfactorily investigated a few complaints. We haven't had many. But my main point here is something different, and that is without a complaint, we don't investigate. So somebody has to complain. And, Jeff Marcy was brought to account because 4 very brave people filed a complaint with Berkeley's Title IX office. They did an investigation. They found that some of the charges were substantiated. That was all confidential and unknown to most of the world until BuzzFeed was about to break an article And then the AAS and I personally got an email from Jeff Marcy. He posted an apology on his website, and 5 days later he resigned from the pressure of his colleagues. The problem is that making a complaint, if we are honest, it is risky. Jeff Marcy was a very senior astronomer, is a very senior astronomer, and in his field he's arguably the most prominent scientist in the world, or one of a handful. So he has a lot of control of people's careers who want to pursue that field. So it's the responsibility of leaders to investigate complaints and to make sure that the people who complain are protected from retaliation. In Jeff Marcy's case, it appears that his colleagues, some of his colleagues, were more concerned about his well-being than about the well-being of the students he was accused of harassing. And that has to end, or we can't fix the situation. It's also the responsibility of bystanders to speak up. A very successful young astronomer who was one of Marcy's students recently posted something on his blog talking about how he had seen bad behavior when he was a graduate student at Berkeley, but he didn't report it to anyone because he was afraid of his career. And now, 7 years later, he is publicly coming out and apologizing for not having said anything, because he's now a tenured professor in a top-ranked program. I think bystanders really have the responsibility of reporting unacceptable behavior in real time, not 7 years later. There are many confidential channels for such reports, and it need not be a huge career risk. Some of us are talking about a possible kind of information escrow account where people could report their experiences, and it could sit there until the multiple reports about an individual accumulated. There is some software you might have heard of, a project called Callisto, which is currently doing this for cases of sexual assault in collaboration with universities and other institutions. But maybe there could be one for sexual harassment as well. In the meantime, the AAS is beefing up our visibility of our anti-harassment policy. Even if many of our members are by now familiar with it, 600 to 700 undergraduates attend our winter meeting, and so it's their first meeting and they don't know our policy. So we're making it very visible in the meeting app, in all our materials that we hand out, in signage in the hall. We also are having a telephone hotline for reporting harassment. We're having a special town hall on harassment, sort of like this one, I suppose. Another special session on the inclusive astronomy meeting last summer, which was about inclusion and equity. And we have an interesting grassroots effort called Astronomy Allies that provides vetted escorts for people who are being harassed or stalked during a meeting. You can text them, you can email them, you can call a number, you can wave at someone who has the right badge. Beyond that policy, we've taken steps to strengthen our efforts toward equity and inclusion. And I won't list all the ways, but let me just mention a couple. We had a summit meeting of our diversity committees to talk about how to deal with what they want to accomplish in their next few years. I've created a presidential early career advisory board consisting solely of young astronomers who are just starting out so that we can get their voices in our processes. And many of us have been vocal on the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We issued a statement a few days after the BuzzFeed article hit the news. And I've just sent out a letter on the GRE and physics GRE talking about how they are biased in their calibrations. The calibrations for women and people who are not white are different than the calibrations for white men. So I've been talking here about our anti-harassment policy. That applies in our venues. We also have a code of ethics, as does the AGU. It's much less specific, and it has no enforcement mechanism. So one of the first things we did when the Marcy business hit the press is I created a task force that would look at our code of ethics, compare it to those of other professional societies, and build in a process for dealing with violations and possible sanctions. That could be anything from, as Christine said, from prohibiting people from coming to meetings to throwing them out of the society. One person even suggested we try to claw back prizes. I don't know if that can happen, but let me close by talking about a big part of the problem that we haven't really grappled with yet, I think, and that is, for many of us, our work is a very big part of our lives, and the line between work and personal life is a bit blurry. We spend a lot of time at work. It's part of our identity. So we make friends at work. Some of us married fellow colleagues. I married a fellow graduate student. Indeed, I think the partners of 2/3 of women in physics are scientists. So it's really natural to but just to conflate the two spheres in our lives. But when in doubt, I think we should all ask ourselves a very simple question. Would or could my action here possibly harm the professional progress of this person? What I'm talking about, if yes, don't go there, okay? Suppose you're a senior person, a professor, and you are completely smitten in love with a junior person in your field, perhaps in your department, perhaps somewhere else. If the unpleasant end of that relationship would hurt let's put it this way. The unpleasant end of that relationship, if it started, would hurt the junior person. We've seen this time and time again. So unless you are willing to quit your job and look for a position at a different university from the junior person you're interested in, then don't go there, because that person is going to pay the price, not you. If you're willing to pay the price, get a job across town at the other university and pursue this romance that you're so... Oh, sorry, I don't mean to be sarcastic, but that's what the stakes really are. What happens when it goes well, perhaps the couple stays together and they're well known as, having met in graduate school or whatever. But when it doesn't go well, typically the junior person, and it's usually a woman, is out of the profession. I'm very glad to say that Yale University has a strict policy that no faculty member may date any undergraduate, full stop, in recognition of the power imbalance in that relationship, and also that undergraduates are still fairly young. For graduate students, the policy is a bit relaxed because they're a bit older, but you still can't date anyone who's in your department or a closely related department. I think these are the policies we should have. I think that all such relationships should be declared openly so that retaliation can be checked on, and I think we have to move quickly in this direction to preserve the professional viability of our youngest and most vulnerable members. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Dr. Williams and Dr. Urry. And thank you, AGU, for starting this conversation. It's such an important one. I have 3 main points I'd like to cover in my 10 minutes. First, I'd like to cover what are the numbers of women in geosciences. There's a general sense, I think, that about 50% of the undergraduates are women. So we'll fact check that. The second point is there is a systematic approach available to us to move toward gender equity. The third is, in addition to harassment and outright discrimination, there is subtle implicit bias at play that impacts women's progress. And if there's time, a fourth, what is the role of professional societies in addressing this issue? So here are the numbers of women in the geosciences, and you can see the proportion of bachelor's degrees that have been awarded to women in the blue curve. And that curve has actually been moved forward 7 years to compare it to the proportion of PhDs that have gone to women over time since NSF began collecting these data back in about 66 or so. And where the curves overlap, there's no proportionate loss of women from the academic pipeline between bachelor's degree and PhD. And you can see that for the geosciences, there's a fair amount of at least closeness of the curves, that we don't have a huge issue losing women proportionately between the bachelor's and PhD. That's not true for other STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. So we're doing a good job up to that point. You can see the next set of data are the green triangles, which are for assistant professor, and those data come from the American Geoscience Institute's Directory of Geoscience Department, so it's a different data set. But it shows that where we're losing women in the academic pipeline is between the PhD and the entry-level position. So that is where we need to put most of our focus in the geosciences. So here's the mechanism to address this. NSF noticed these data. They noticed that women were increasingly getting degrees in the sciences, but they were not showing up as PIs on grant proposals. And so they initiated the advanced program in 2001. It's in the EHR directorate. And their approach, after trying many different programs over the previous 2 decades, this approach was unique in that it targets institutions, institutional practices and policies, not to fix the woman, but to fix the workplace that is not welcoming and nurturing and culturing for women. Okay, so institutions have practices and policies that are gendered, which means they have a more negative impact on women than they have on men. Sometimes it's a little bit more, sometimes it's a lot more. So for example, if there's no daycare on campus or near campus or no referral service, the way our culture is set up now, with women usually doing most of the child rearing, and I know that's decreasing, so not really, that has a more negative impact on women faculty with young children than it does on men. So those are examples of gendered practices and policies that the advanced program is intended to address. In addition, people with advanced grants try to address climate within institutions and departments. And by climate geoscientists, I don't mean weather long term. I mean, what does it feel like to be in a department? How are you treated? How are you valued? How are you included? And also Advance addresses the search process in detail and really every evaluative process. Because, point number 3, another factor that's holding women back is the implicit assumptions that all of us hold. What are implicit assumptions? They are mental shortcuts, heuristics. Most of our brain is operating below our conscious level most of the time because it's hard work thinking. It takes a lot of energy to feed that brain to think. And so a lot of our day-to-day life is on automatic pilot. And most of that is absorbed from the culture that we grow up in. So we share, regardless of gender, regardless of race, ethnicity, we share the same implicit assumptions that our society that raised us has. Is that right? Since I'm not a social scientist, I gotta check in. All right, so these are below our consciousness. Sometimes it's called unconscious bias. Implicit assumptions become biases when they have some negative impact on a particular group. They're useful because thinking is hard, as we all know, how hungry and tired we are at the end of studying all day or trying to write a paper or proposal. Again, the same biases shared by men and women. And so, for example, if you say the word doctor in our culture, the first thing that comes to your mind is a male. Or if we say nurse, the first thing that comes to our mind is a woman. And even though not all doctors are men and not all nurses are women. And another implicit assumption our society holds is that scientists are men. So when you say the word scientist to a typical American, and even a typical scientist American, the first thing that pops into our mind is a white male in a white lab coat. And there are dozens, perhaps hundreds now, research studies that show that this is a real phenomenon and has a real negative effect on the group that is biased against. So here's just one study. Experimental data in the U.S. show that success terms match with what we consider our implicit biases towards male characteristics. So, for example, independent and task-oriented, we associate those characteristics with men. And success does not match with characteristics we associate with women, such as communal and nurturing. So if you think about letters of recommendation for entering grad school, for getting a job in academia, for getting tenure, and one letter says that this candidate is independent and task-oriented, and another letter says this person is communal and nurturing, who are you going to hire? So there's bias built in to the whole system. And that bias adds up. Virginia Valian calls this the accumulation of disadvantage. So the graph here shows the results of a computer model that shows how the proportion of two groups would vary as you progress up in an organization going through evaluative steps. With no implicit bias, obviously, you're going to have the same proportions of people at each step. But with 1% bias built into this program, you can see the enormous impact it has. And this is one way that we can explain that the proportion of women who are at full professor rank in geoscience in the U.S. is about 10%. Okay. Same as physics. And which are both worse than bioscience, for example. So, and as has been mentioned, AGU does have some mechanisms in place to address harassment at conferences. We have this Ethics and Code of Conduct for Meeting statement. AGU does require implicit bias training for members of evaluative committees for the honors and awards programs. And I put the words implicit Harvard. If you Google those two words, you can find a lot more about implicit bias, and take an implicit bias test yourself. They also have a non-geoscientist who is the person you report to if there are any violations of the Code of Conduct. However, how many of you knew that there was a code of conduct for meetings before you walked into the room this afternoon? So we need to do a better job of getting the word out, and especially getting the word out about what is the route you need to take if there is a violation that you have seen or that you have experienced. And we might think about the organizers of the fall meeting might think about this. This is one of the most fun things that's come across my desk in the last month or so. And this is a conference diversity distribution calculator. And it calculates, if you know the percentage of women in the organization, and for AGU it's 26%, it will calculate for you how likely it is that a session or a panel has no women on it. And you'll see that nowadays, we really have to try to have sessions and panels with no women on them in the geosciences. That should not be happening based on our numbers. And this has never happened at AGU. This was in the news earlier this month at a conference in England. A scientist was bumped from the conference for being pregnant. So we can thank thank heavens for small victories. And I would like to start the conversation, or hope that we start a conversation on another topic. We don't have time to cover this today, obviously, but sexual assault in the field. And since most of us have to do field work in order to get our degree and continue to progress in our science, this is a really important topic we need to talk about. Over 1/4 of women in field-based situations have experienced sexual assault, according to this one study. And this is a list of suggestions that were generated by a National Academies of Sciences committee for professional societies, things that they can do to encourage and increase the number of women of color in STEM, because this is a huge issue. And there, Billy's standing up and saying, "Get off the stage, Marianne." So I just have one more shameless promotion. This is the book Suzanne O'Connell, Kuhele Dute, and I have just edited, and it's available at the Wiley stand. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those great presentations. I'd like to invite the other panelists up. Erika, Marin-Spiotta, Blair Schneider, and Eric Davidson. I know.
Sorry, I'm going to push you up.
It's fine. It's fine. I'll stand on the edge here. Before we open up to the audience for question and answer, Q&A, I'd like to hear from Erika and Blair about how they see the role of AWG and ESWN in helping adjudicate and bring to forth these kinds of complaints and helping daylight them and deal with them.
Absolutely.
They have to get turned on. We've had this before. No, they have to turn them on. Yeah. We are not able. I've experienced this before. I'm sure I can figure it out.
Start with that one.
Start with this one. So, as the representative for AWG, for many of you that know AWG, we've been around for several decades now, and we have 3 goals, and it's to enhance, exchange, and encourage the participation of women in geosciences. And I'm ever so grateful for AGU for confronting this topic head on. And as most of you that are AWG members who have heard of us, we don't have our own conference. And so our goal is to be present at all of the major conferences, including AGU, GSA, AAPG, etc. And I'm really looking forward to, we've already had some conversations about how AWG can be used as an asset at these conferences from now on, and perhaps have someone who's trained in how to deal with sexual harassment, or somebody you can go and ask questions to, get advice from. AWG has always served as a booth in the past, regardless, for people to come and tell us their stories. But one thing we've been really under-resourced on is providing someone there that can really legally and professionally answer your questions. And that's our future goal for how we will be moving forward.
And the Earth Science Women's Network is about 12 years old, and we also don't have our own conference, and so we have members and leadership that participates and works with, for example, AGU, doing professional development and making sure that AGU is a more inclusive place as well. And one of the things we've really been working on is just raising awareness, and so we are thrilled that this is here, and I think it's being videotaped, and so there will be a record of it. And then working with leadership of other societies, and we're very excited to work with each other as well. And we've thought about having some of our leaders be trained in kind of, providing resources for our members, because we hear horror stories, but I'm a professor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a therapist. I'm not. How can I help our members? And so that's something we're looking to the leadership of professional societies to see if we can have resources. Sometimes it's hard to go to your university, and we have members who are just scared about talking to their own university. But I think that's one place where professional societies could work.
Thanks, Erika. Eric, you want to?
No, I'm two-fisted here.
Your stereo here.
So I'm pleased to be on this panel. I had the honor of serving on the Honors and Recognition Task Force that was addressing the bias issues there. And it was quite instructive to see over the course of the work of that task force how much we all learned and became aware because we took the time to teach ourselves these things. And some people, of course, like Marianne, already was well aware before going into the panel, but most of us weren't, both men and women. To me, that was a lesson about how much this unconscious bias there is, and how the only way to address the unconscious bias is to do so consciously. And the part of the discussion that I think we need to have more of, although I was very pleased to see the discussion we had here so far, is not so much about how to keep men from being part of the problem, but also how to get them to be part of the solution, to help create that environment, that climate, I guess was the word that was used, so that this discussion can go forward. And in some cases, it's a difficult step. In some cases, there's some pretty easy little baby steps that can be made. For instance, before this meeting, I sent out an email to everyone in my university to let them know about this session. And it turns out it generated a lot of conversation. It generated some meetings that I had nothing to do with. I'm not claiming any credit, but just the little baby step of having alerted people to, yes, this topic is happening, so you might want to think about it. And I'm also going to alert them after the end of this that, hey, it was taped, you know. If you're interested, you could tune in.
Thank you, Eric. I do want to reiterate something. I want to urge people to go to that Harvard site and take the implicit bias test. It's pretty illuminating and very interesting, and it does make you think about how you think about other people. So I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. Sarah, do I have to wander around with the microphone? Or is there one out there?
There's a mic.
Oh, right there. There's a mic there. Oh, good. I'm glad I don't have to be a game show host.
Don't be nervous.
Are you happy with this response?
Yeah. What, can you go up to the microphone?
Questions or recommendations on what AGU should be doing as well?
Sure. Following up on Eric's point, it's actually an interview question that I had a year ago, which was how do you encourage, I was asked this, how do you encourage men to see themselves as part of the solution to gender inequity? And it is very, very difficult. And you look around this room, and there are a handful of men here. Congratulations to them. I think it's great. How do we get more men to come to these things? How do we get more men to realize, to do things like take the implicit bias test? My boss has done that. He was shocked by the result because he's very conscious about trying to address these issues. But how do we get men interested and get them to realize that it's a problem that affects them as well as women?
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name's Sarah, and I'm at NASA, and I work with science communicators and training scientists in communication and encouraging them to do that. And one of the things that has come up a lot in conversation with that group is what happens when you are communicating about your science using social media, for example, and you experience harassment online. And so it's not really in the workplace, and you're not technically really even working with other people at your institution. You're doing your job by communicating what you do, but you're experiencing harassment from maybe a stranger, a member of the public, a person who is outside of your institution. And I'm just wondering if any of you have been involved in conversations about that and what the role of scientific societies or the institution, the workplace, is in that kind of a situation.
Anyone want to answer that or say something?
I'll start with a response to encouraging men in this conversation. This is just one small solution that AWG tries to encourage is that for example, at our awards breakfast at the Geological Society of America, we have an awards breakfast every year, and we give out about 30 awards, I believe. And pretty much all of them go to female, recognizing their excellence in what they've been doing in the geosciences. We do have some flexibility in a few of our awards to give them to anyone. And so this past year, I gave 2 awards to men because I think it's incredibly important to recognize that these are men who have been greatly supporting what women are doing in the geosciences. And after the breakfast was over, I had a wonderful conversation with some students who were concerned by the fact that we had given men awards. They were very confused as to why we would do that if this is a group for women in the geosciences. And I had, I think, a very productive conversation with them as to if you don't recognize men who are supporting women in geosciences, how are they going to know why they need to do it, why it's important? How are you going to encourage other men if they don't have male role models who are encouraging women in geosciences? So that's just kind of one of the small ways that AWG tries to impart to men the importance of supporting women in geosciences. Anyone else has other examples?
One of the advanced institutions initiated, this was UC Irvine, and many others adopted a concept called equity advisors. And these are male faculty who get training in implicit bias, and then they become the voice for diversity on campus. And they sit on search committees, and it relieves women of the burden of being the voice for diversity as they sit on every bloody committee. They don't have to sit on the committees anymore. The equity advisors take over this, and there may be some way to have AGU adopt something like that.
Well, I was going to say one of the things that AGU does is for every committee, every task force, we have, we're in a very large organization with a lot of diverse perspectives, and it's very important to have diversity in the perspectives, which can be gender, career stage, geography, and we make sure that on every committee and task force that we have obviously the appropriate experience for whatever the committee is, but really always making sure that we've got people from a variety of perspectives in everything that we do.
You say something?
Meg?
So I don't want to be the voice of doom here, but let me just say why I think this is so hard. It's partly because many people feel our scientific enterprise in the United States is as good as it could possibly be. We have a lot of Nobel Prize winners. We have a lot of successful discoveries. And so people think that they equate opening the doors to diversity with somehow dumbing down the profession. And we have to, I mean, those of us up here on stage, and most of you, I expect, realize this is bunk, but we have to address that head on. They don't believe that science could be better than it is now. Second point is there's no reward for this at most of our institutions. Most of our institutions, I've been a department chair, the annual discussion with the provost's office has nothing to do with how much diversity you've created in your department. It has to do with square footage given to experiments and who won what prize and yada yada. So our institutions, especially maybe because of tenure, are very slow to change. That said, let me applaud the men who, in the case of astronomy, really stood up last fall, in October. Shockingly, to me, I have to say, I got my PhD 30 years ago, I couldn't believe the reaction where they stood up and said, this guy's got to go. That was so things can change, but it's not, let's not kid ourselves that it's just a matter of thinking, right, it's going to be really hard.
Right. Next.
Hi, I just want to talk about my experience as a foreign grad student, and also like ethnic minority, although Asians is sometimes are not deemed as minority for some reason. There is a problem that I guess you guys have been like missing the point. I mean, the first and one of the gender bias I have ever experienced is actually in the United States. Like, surprise, surprise, I'm from Hong Kong, by the way. The thing is, like, one time I had as a grad student, it was okay, nobody. You know what? I'm anonymous. So the problem is like, okay, in a hypothetical situation. I'm not saying I experienced that, like nothing. So it's that if I had experienced, I mean, if somebody had experienced it, then you tell somebody like who are like your supervisor or somebody, they can say, okay, what is your evidence? Do you have evidence? Like if it is verbal, you don't have like or even just a touch, and then they would say, you know what, maybe it's your English sucks, and okay, they don't say it that way. They would say you misunderstand their English. They really don't mean it that way because in our culture, we really mean it the other way, or maybe it's a joking and maybe you're too sensitive. Like that is something that, and also not only that, even if I have a secret recording, but by the way, I was told that in my state, if I do secret recording and gather the evidence, it's illegal. So I am the illegal, and that evidence cannot be used. Okay, so assume I could have done that. And then I would bear the responsibility as a whistleblower. Everybody is going to know that, it's like Hong Kong like 30 years ago when people get raped and then the women would got all the name on the newspaper, although like right now they are protected. But if in an academia world, everybody knows one another. And if I do a whistleblower and say, you know what, my supervisor or so Professor God or Professor Big Shot did that to me, and then, you know what, I mean, then I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose a career as a female scientist. And you know what, maybe I'm too sensitive, or maybe so my total reputation got completely dumbed down. So this is like 2 points that I would like to make as like and as a foreigner, I mean, I'm even worse situation instead. In fact, because I'm not in I cannot get NSF grant and blah, 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 something. Although the upside is that they cannot tell my gender from my name. So that is the only good sign that I am going to bring it to.
Thank you. Can we take the next two questions together? Maybe we can put them, because we're coming to the end of the time, so maybe you could make the question a comment and then have the panel wrap up.
I'll try and be quick. So sorry, it's slightly back to the topic about how to get more men involved. I'm Kelsey Singer. I'm involved in a lot of women in planetary science events, and thank you so much for having this, by the way. But two things real quick we do is for our events that are called something like Women in Networking Discussion Hour, we have a Bring a Guest program to try and say if someone, you know someone who might be interested, but they wouldn't feel comfortable coming because they see that it's, they think they'd be taking a spot from a woman or something like that. They can be encouraged to come as if they're coming with a guest of someone. That seems to be working fairly well as we have increasing numbers of men in our events. And we just had some men start a men's auxiliary where they specifically have discussions about harassment, and that was all their own initiative, but it's a really great example. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. So I'm kind of integrating them, I guess. Like, I feel like our discussion mostly has been sort of how AGU and these societies can act on, like, the defense, like how to help women who have these problems and help victims, and then bringing men in is kind of talking about, like, going on the offense. How can we get people to realize these issues? And so I have two concerns about each side of this, I guess. Like, I think AGU needs to really be taking the lead on this, because if we have it going to a women's only group, then I think it will be harder to get men involved. And you also do have the separation of women of color or women from different ethnicities even knowing about this women's only group. And then all the points she said about, like, once something has happened, it can be really hard to deal with, and, like, active bystanders and things like that all still rely on, like, having a really good offense, like, people aren't really trained on how to be an active bystander or things like that. So I guess just a discussion of how AGU would really take the lead on these things.
Well, thank you. That's one of the reasons we're here, is to try to figure out what's the role of the societies. I mean, we certainly, as Billy mentioned earlier, have, we're going to try to strengthen a lot of our policies, but a lot of that has to do with communication of knowing what they are. AGU wants to get a vision of the future is to galvanize a community of earth and space sciences to promote science and benefit humanity, and that's the community part. We need people to be working in appropriate ways with each other, and so as Meg said, it's hard, but we're little by little, one day at a time kind of thing, trying to move things forward. And so that is helpful, of not just the offense, but trying to create an environment for everybody. Well, I want to thank you all for sharing your insights and experiences, and I think today's discussion was very informative. I tweeted quite a few quotes, by the way. So to close out the session, I would like to invite our president, AG's president, Margaret Leinen, to share a few reflections of her own. And let's thank the panelists, too.
Again, thanks to all of you as panelists, and thank you all for coming. I think that what we saw with the whole unfolding of this so publicly with Dr. Marcy's situation was that there was a role for scientific societies, and that that many times scientific society may have the ability to act when a university itself or the employer has either legal or procedural impediments, and that caused us to look at this and say, all right, what is the role of AGU? And we came out with a number of things. First, that we have a responsibility to be proactive on this, not just reactive. We don't want to wait for a situation to erupt within the earth and space science community that is going to call upon us to act, but really to take some proactive measures. Second, that there's a lot that we can do to educate our members, whether those are student members, faculty members, staff, employers in the public sector, and so forth. And I think you've given us some great examples from both the work that you've done as a scholar, experiences that AAS has had, things that, Marianne, you've worked in this area for so long and given so much to us already, but it doesn't mean that we still can't learn. I think that just this morning I heard several suggestions for how AGU can look at the processes, policies, and procedures of other societies to make sure that we are using best practices for everything associated with harassment, but also with proactive work to educate our members. So we're committed to having the society open this up. I think that your suggestion that we work with AWG and the network, but allow you to be independent is a great one, and I think that that's a very positive thing. We've already talked to NSF Geosciences about this as well. They're very interested in this issue, but they feel like they, as the funding agency, other than making sure their own processes are sensitive to this, can't really reach out. But they're very interested in having AGU reach out and have encouraged us to do that. So I think that my reflection is that there's a lot more that we can do, that we're committed to doing that, and that we really look forward to working with all of you to help make that possible. And we really appreciate your insights and your willingness to help us.